8 boats, 1 destroyer, 8 minutes. That's the whole equation. And the men in those fast boats had already done the math wrong before they cleared the inlet. It's dusk over the Strait of Hormuz. The light has gone copper-orange at the horizon, the kind that turns the water into hammered bronze and makes everything at distance look bigger than it is. Somewhere off Larak Island, at the eastern approach to the strait's narrowest point, a single Arleigh Burke-class destroyer holds a blockade line. 11,000 tons, 490 feet of steel drawing 20 feet of draft, radar arrays turning in the warm Gulf air. The crew is at modified watch. The word from the operations center has been the same for 3 days. Elevated threat profile, fast boat activity on the Iranian side, harassment runs that keep probing the edges of the exclusion zone without quite crossing it. The destroyer has been here long enough that her crew has found a rhythm. Watch rotations are tighter than normal, 4 hours on, 4 off, because the threat assessment has been elevated to the point where no section of the crew is considered fully off duty. The operations center, buried in the ship's interior away from windows and spray, glows in the dim red-blue light of screens that never go dark. The tactical action officer on this watch has been tracking the same 3 clusters of contacts on the Iranian coast for 6 hours. They moved, they stopped, they moved again. Small contacts close to shore, the kind of signature the radar classifies as likely small surface combatants, which is the Navy's polite term for fast boats with guns, until tonight. Tonight, the IRGC Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has decided that probing is finished. Someone in a coastal command post near the shore gave an order, and 8 fiberglass hulls with outboard engines screaming at full throttle punched out of an inlet and turned their bows directly at the American ship. Their wakes fan white against the darkening water. They're spreading as they run, not in a column, not in a neat formation, but in a loose, ragged arc, the classic swarm geometry designed to do one specific thing: overwhelm a single point of defense by forcing it to track multiple simultaneous threats from multiple angles. This is IRGC fast boat doctrine. It's not new. It dates to the tanker war of the 1980s, refined across decades of exercises in these exact waters. The logic is brutal in its simplicity. Cheap hulls are expendable, the ocean is wide, and if you can force an enemy weapons system to prioritize one target, the others are free to close the distance. Get close enough, and even an Arleigh Burke has a problem. Fast boats can carry rocket-propelled grenades, heavy machine guns, recoilless rifles, and in more recent configurations, man-portable anti-ship missiles. Some are rigged as waterborne explosives, floating bombs with a driver willing to make that final calculation. 8 boats in the swarm against 1 destroyer's layered guns. On paper, someone in Tehran thought those numbers looked promising. They were wrong. But let's walk through exactly why. Because the answer isn't simply America has better weapons. It's about what those weapons do in sequence and how the sequence unfolds in 8 minutes. What's most surprising about this engagement isn't the outcome, it's how quickly the outcome was settled. Most people assume a naval engagement of this type involves minutes of tracking, escalating warnings, command authorization chains. The common picture is wrong in one key detail. By the time those fast boats cleared the inlet and committed to their run, the engagement clock had already started, and almost nothing they did after that point could have changed the result. The AN/SLQ-32 electronic warfare system aboard the destroyer had been watching the Iranian coast for hours. The SLQ-32, crews call it the Slick 32, is a surface ship electronic warfare suite doing several things at once. It listens. It identifies emitters. It classifies radar signatures and radio frequency emissions from surface contacts. And in a swarm scenario, it starts sorting the picture. Which contacts are carrying active fire control radar? Which are decoys running hot on the surface to draw attention? Which are the actual threat vectors? That's the problem the IRGC swarm doctrine is trying to exploit. Send 8 boats with 4 acting as decoys. Faster, noisier, drawing the radar picture, and the 4 that actually matter might close to dangerous. Range before the defender can reorient. It's a reasonable theory. In the 1980s, against less capable systems, it sometimes worked. Against the SLQ-32 feeding data to the ship's combat management system in 2026, it doesn't. Here's the piece the IRGC planners didn't fully account for. The destroyer's combat system doesn't make decisions sequentially. It doesn't pick target 1, engage, reassess, pick target 2. The AN/SY-1D radar, the Aegis system's primary sensor, is a phased array that tracks hundreds of contacts simultaneously. The combat system is processing all 8 boats at once, assigning threat prioritization scores based on closure rate, bearing, electronic emissions, and geometric position relative to the ship. By the time the fast boats have covered the first mile of their run, the ship's fire control solution is already built. What the IRGC boats see from their side: a gray shape at the horizon that doesn't appear to be reacting, no visible movement on deck, no obvious weapons training toward them. Partly because the ship's sensors don't need to point at you to track you. The phased array is fixed. Its beams are electronic. It's watching everything. And partly because the first weapon that speaks in this engagement doesn't require a visible turret swinging on target. The Mark 38 machine gun system is a 25mm chain gun on a stabilized pedestal operated remotely from inside the ship on a joystick and monitored. The gunner doesn't stand exposed on deck in a swarm engagement. The system's effective range against small surface targets runs to roughly 2,000 meters, and in its Block 3 configuration, it integrates directly with the ship's combat management system. The targeting solution is handed to the gun automatically. Inside the operations center, the tactical action officer has just received weapons-free authorization from the commanding officer. The call was brief. The CO had been watching the closure rate on his display for 90 seconds before he picked up the handset. The fastboat's intent was no longer ambiguous. Their spread geometry, speed, and bearing all resolved into a single classification in the combat system. Hostile surface contacts, committed attack profile. The ROE threshold had been crossed. Authorization took 4 seconds to communicate. The Mark 38 was already slewed to bearing. The lead boats are closing through 3 miles. The swarm arc is spreading wider, trying to force the ship to split its attention across a broader front. Someone in the IRGC formation is watching the destroyer carefully, waiting for the moment it becomes clear the Americans are reacting, calculating whether to press or brake. That calculation is about to be made for them. The Mark 38 opens up. The sound at this range reaches the Iranian boats roughly 9 seconds after the gun fires. By then, the first rounds have already arrived. The 25mm shells, high-explosive incendiary rounds, walk across the water in short controlled bursts, the gunner deliberately working them into the lead boat. Not a long, sustained burst, short corrections. 3-round groups. The system stabilization keeps the point of impact steady even as the ship moves on the water. The lead IRG fast boat takes hits somewhere around the bow. What happens next depends on what the boat is carrying, but at minimum, a 25mm HI round through a fiberglass hull at this range produces fire. If there's fuel exposed, it produces more than fire. The lead boat loses momentum. Its wake disappears. Now the swarm has a problem it didn't anticipate. The engagement is no longer theoretical. The man in the boat directly behind the lead boat, less than 200 meters back in the loose formation, can see what just happened. The calculation running in his mind, press or brake. The doctrine says press. The instinct forming in real time says something different. In the operations center aboard the destroyer, the watch team isn't celebrating. The tactical action officer is already cueing the second engagement sequence. The Mk-45 fire control radar has locks on the 3 outermost boats in the swarm arc, the ones running wide, trying to stay outside the Mark 38 envelope while the lead elements drew the close-in weapon. The ops team knows this geometry. They've trained against it. The outriders aren't safe because they're far. They're simply being handled by a different gun. The 5-inch gun, the Mk-45 54 caliber naval gun on the destroyer's bow, is now speaking to the trailing boats. This is a fundamentally different weapon than the Mark 38. The 5-inch fires a round weighing roughly 32 kilograms. Its effective range against surface targets exceeds 13 nautical miles. In this engagement, the trailing boats are perhaps 1.5 miles beyond the Mark 38's practical engagement zone, using the swarm spread to stay outside the close-in defense while the lead boats drew fire. The Mk-45 collapses that geometry. A naval gun round at this range arrives before the sound does. The first boat to receive fire from the 5-inch has no warning. It simply stops being a coherent vessel. The round's detonation on or near a small fiberglass hull at this range isn't a graze. The trailing boats aren't armored. They're fast, maneuverable, and completely unprotected against naval gunfire. The choice of guns over missiles in this engagement is deliberate, and it's worth understanding because it tells you something important about how the U.S. Navy thinks about the swarm threat. Here's the take that'll probably draw some argument. Using a $5 million SM-6 to engage a $30,000 fastboat isn't a military failure, it's a strategic one. The IRG swarm doctrine is explicitly designed to drain American missile magazines. Every SM-6 fired at a cheap hull is one fewer interceptor available for the anti-ship missile that comes after the swarm. The IRG knows this. The magazine depth problem is real, and the Iranians have studied it carefully. So when this destroyer's commanding officer authorizes the Mark 38 and the Mk-45 rather than reaching for the missile cells, that decision isn't conservatism. It's a direct counter to the Iranian strategy. The guns are effectively inexhaustible in the time frame of this engagement. The magazine doesn't run dry after 8 boats. That's why guns, not missiles, answered. But here's the layer of this story that changes the picture entirely, because the swarm isn't broken yet at this point. 4 boats are damaged or destroyed. 4 are still running. The geometry has shifted. Surviving boats have scattered, broken formation, some turning back toward the Iranian coast, some cutting hard to the north, trying to get out of the engagement envelope. One, and this is the detail I keep coming back to when I go back through the sequence, one boat holds its course. One crew doesn't break. They keep the bow pointed at the destroyer. Put yourself in that boat for a second. The lead element is gone. The boats on your flanks are turning. The gun that just destroyed the boat ahead of you is ranging towards you. And whoever is in command of your small hull has decided that the mission continues. What are they betting on? What do they think is going to go differently for them than it did for the boats that just burned? There is a man at the helm of that boat. We don't know his name from the open source record. We don't know his age. What we can reconstruct from the engagement timeline is that he had approximately 90 seconds between the moment the swarm began to scatter and the moment his boat came under direct fire from the Hornet's targeting pod. 90 seconds in which the evidence of what was happening around him was complete and unambiguous, and he chose to continue. That choice is a data point the IRGC will study in its after-action reports. It'll be categorized as either devotion or miscalculation. It may be both. The answer comes from overhead. The FCA-18 Super Hornet had been holding a combat air patrol east of the strait, assigned to the carrier strike group operating in the northern Arabian Sea. When the fast boat engagement was called, the Hornet was already inbound. Its transit time to the engagement area from its holding point is measured in minutes. The aircraft carries a targeting pod and is configured with a loadout that includes AGM-65 Maverick air-to-surface missiles and the aircraft's own 20mm M61 Vulcan cannon. The Hornet rolls in from the north, descending the targeting pod on the boat that held course. At the altitudes involved, the crew of the fast boat hears the aircraft before they see it, a rising sound that in these waters, in this context, carries a specific meaning. There is a moment, and I want you to think about this, there is a moment where the person driving that boat understands what is about to happen, and still has a choice. Turn back, brake left, scatter, the Maverick is already away. The AGM-65 Maverick is an electro-optical or infrared-guided missile. In its most common naval variant, it homes on contrast, the heat signature of an engine, the shape of a hull against water. At this engagement distance from this altitude, time of flight is under 10 seconds. The boat that held course doesn't have 10 seconds of meaningful decision-making left. The impact is visible to the destroyer's crew on their sensor feeds. One more wake disappears from the radar picture. The Hornet makes one more pass along the northern scatter line, not engaging the retreating boats but being seen, being visible. The aircraft's presence over the engagement area is itself a message to every hull still moving away from the blockade line. The engagement envelope extends into the air, and the air moves faster than your boat. Elapsed time from the first burst of the Mark 38 to the Hornet's departure from the engagement area. 8 minutes and change. The blockade line holds. The formation of IRGC fast boats that cleared the inlet at dusk is no longer a formation. What remains is scattered hulls, some burning, some limping back toward the Iranian coast, some simply gone from the surface picture. The Strait of Hormuz remains open, at least in the narrow physical sense. The U.S. destroyer resumes its station. The crew goes back to elevated watch. And in a coastal command post somewhere near Larak Island, someone is writing a report that nobody in Tehran is going to enjoy reading. Consider what that report contains and what it doesn't. It records the loss of the boats and the crew. It records the approximate timeline of the engagement. What it can't fully capture is the speed of the American response, because the speed is the thing that breaks the doctrine's assumptions. The IRGC swarm theory was built on the premise that a human decision chain would introduce latency, that a ship's commanding officer, facing a swarm attack at dusk with uncertain political authorization, would hesitate, that the ambiguity, is this a real attack or another harassment probe, would buy the swarm time. The Aegis system and its integration with the SLQ-32 stripped that ambiguity out before the boats had crossed the halfway point of their run. The CO's decision wasn't difficult because the system had already answered the classification question. The only thing left for a human being to authorize was the firing. That's the detail that'll be hardest to write into a report without it sounding like an excuse. The swarm didn't fail because of bad luck or poor weather or an alert crew on deck with binoculars. It failed because the classification problem the swarm was designed to exploit had been solved before the boats left the inlet. Here's what the numbers look like from the Iranian side, and this is where a tactical loss becomes a strategic problem. An IRGC fast boat, a Bogomar, or a locally produced equivalent, costs somewhere between $30,000 and $80,000 depending on configuration. 8 boats represent a capital loss of perhaps $500,000, plus crew, plus whatever weapons and equipment was aboard. Against that, the American expenditure in this engagement was effectively gun rounds. 25mm ammunition runs somewhere around $30 a round in bulk procurement. The Mk-45 5-inch rounds are more expensive, a few $100s each. The Maverick missile is in a different category, roughly $70,000 per round. But one Maverick in this scenario versus a sustained engagement that might have required multiple missiles if the swarm had gotten closer. The math isn't devastating for the Americans. What is devastating is the crew loss. Fast boats in the IRGC Navy aren't automated, they carry men. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy recruits from Iranian coastal communities, fishermen's sons mostly, young men who grew up on these waters. The families in those communities aren't abstractions. They are the human cost of a doctrine that sends cheap hulls against a ship that can engage them at 2 kilometers with a stabilized automatic cannon. The IRGC command is not unaware of this cost. They count it as acceptable. The young men in the boats may or may not have been consulted on that calculation. One detail that stuck with me going back through the engagement sequence: the boat that held course after the others scattered. That boat's crew made a choice under conditions of absolute clarity about what was coming. Whatever one thinks about the IRGC's strategic calculus, that is a specific kind of courage, or a specific kind of something, that deserves to be named even as we record that it didn't change the outcome. There are communities on the Iranian coastline that have sent young men into IRGC naval service for 3 generations. These aren't abstract statistics to those communities. When a boat doesn't return, there is a family waiting in a concrete house near a fishing dock who will receive a visit, and a flag, and a story about what their son or husband or brother died doing. The IRGC frames those deaths in particular ways, as martyrdom, as resistance, as the price of standing against American imperialism in the Persian Gulf. Whether the families find those frames adequate is a question the open source record can't answer. What the record shows is that the recruiting has continued. The doctrine has continued. The boats keep going out. But the tactical result isn't the story that matters most. The tactical result is repeatable. Any Arleigh Burke in this strait can produce roughly this outcome against a swarm of this size. That's the problem. Here's what this engagement actually tells us about where we are in the Hormuz equation and why it matters beyond the 8 boats in the 8 minutes. The IRGC fastboat doctrine was built as an asymmetric counter to American naval superiority. The core assumption was that cheap expendable assets in large numbers could neutralize expensive, sophisticated defenses by overwhelming the cost-exchange ratio. That assumption worked, partially when American countermeasures required expensive missiles for every intercept. The shift toward gun-based layered defense, integrated with overhead assets and advanced electronic warfare, has fundamentally changed the exchange rate. The guns don't run dry. The aircraft can refuel and return. The SLQ-32 sees through the swarm's deception geometry. What the IRGC hasn't answered is what replaces the fastboat doctrine if the fastboat doctrine no longer works. There are answers to that question in Iranian naval development programs that are considerably more concerning than a swarm of fiberglass hulls, anti-ship ballistic missiles, submarine operations, autonomous underwater vehicles, layered mine warfare across the strait. These are the capabilities that keep mission planners in Bahrain up late, not the fast boats. Most people focus on the boats because the boats are visible, the white wakes fanning out at dusk, the fire at the end. The assumption is that the fast boat swarm is Iran's primary naval threat. The evidence tells a different story. The boats are a probe. They are an intelligence operation wearing the clothes of an attack. Every engagement like this one teaches the IRGC something about American response timing, weapon sequencing, and sensor coverage. Information that feeds into the development of whatever comes next. The data collection during a swarm engagement isn't incidental. IRGC coastal monitoring stations, positioned along the northern shore of the strait, are watching every engagement with electronic intelligence receivers and optical sensors. They're recording the timing between threat classification and first shot. They're recording which weapon engages at which range. They're recording the Hornet's approach vector, its weapon's release altitude, the time from wheels up on the carrier to arrival over the engagement. All of that goes into a database. All of it informs the next iteration of whatever comes after the fastboat doctrine. The boats that burned tonight weren't wasted from the IRGC's analytical perspective. They were sensors. Expendable sensors that generated data the IRGC couldn't have gotten any other way. Going back through open source reporting on IRGC naval exercises over the last several years, one pattern kept coming up. Systematic improvement in swarm coordination, the timing of launches, the spread geometry, the mix of armed and unarmed hulls in the same formation. This isn't a static doctrine, it's a learning doctrine. And the learning is being done with blood. The question for the American side is whether the layered gun defense that worked tonight, the Mark 38 to the MK-45 to the Hornet, continues to work as swarm sizes scale up. 8 boats is manageable, 16 is more complex, 32 launched simultaneously from multiple coastal points in a coordinated time-on-target sequence, with some hulls carrying anti-ship missiles and others acting as decoys. That is a different problem. The MK-45 can cycle at roughly 20 rounds per minute. The Mark 38 is faster but shorter ranged. At some number, the math does change. The destroyer's commanding officer knows this. Every captain holding a blockade line in the Strait of Hormuz runs this calculation constantly. The answer is not to rely on one ship. The answer is the carrier strike group behind her, the Hornets cycling on and off the deck, the submarine holdings that the Iranians can only guess at, the destroyer's own SM-6 cells that remain untouched in this engagement, precisely because guns handled what the guns could handle, Layered defense means you don't use the SM-6 when the Mark 38 will do. It means the SM-6 is there when something the Mark 38 can't handle comes at you instead. What the layered defense concept also means, though no briefing slide says it this directly, is that the system is only as good as its weakest integration point. The Mark 38 feeds data to the Aegis combat system. The Aegis combat system talks to the Hornet's data link. The Hornet's targeting pod speaks to the Maverick Seeker. That chain has to work, all of it, simultaneously. In an electromagnetic environment, the IRGC is actively trying to degrade with its own electronic warfare assets. One of the things those coastal monitoring stations are also doing during an engagement is jamming, probing for frequencies, looking for the link that breaks first. The fact that the chain held tonight doesn't mean it holds next time if the IRGC has found a seam in the electromagnetic architecture. The commanding officer sitting in his chair in the operations center, watching the last contacts fade from the picture, is aware of all of this. The ship's combat system officer is already pulling the engagement logs for technical debrief. Every second of the timeline will be reviewed. Every system state will be audited. The debrief isn't about what went right, it's about what the enemy learned. Because the IRGC was watching, and what they watched tonight will shape what the Americans face the next time someone in a coastal command post near Larak Island decides that probing is finished. The strait is dark now, the copper light is gone. The Arleigh Burke sits on her station, radar arrays turning, crew cycling through watch rotations that will carry them through until dawn. Somewhere on the Iranian coast, boats that made it back are being hauled up on beaches. The accounting is being done. The reports are being written. And someone in the IRGC command structure is already asking the question this engagement forces. If the fast boat doctrine fails against a single destroyer with guns and one aircraft, what does it actually require to succeed? That question isn't answered by sending more boats the same way. It leads somewhere else. And where it leads is the part of this story that doesn't end tonight. What would you have done in the lead cockpit of that formation? The moment the Mark 38 opened up on the boats ahead of you, press the run or peel off. And if you pressed, what were you betting the destroyer hadn't accounted for? Tell us your version in the comments. And if you want to understand what the threat that actually keeps American commanders awake looks like, the one the fast boats are covering for, that story is next.